You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is...
Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have David Pepper on the show. He has a phenomenal new book. It's called A Simple Choice. And if you love thrillers the way I do, this is a must-have for your late summer to-be-read pile. If you're taking a beach trip or just taking some time alone in your favorite reading chair, this is a book that must be top of pile. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying all those nice things about my book.
Yeah, absolutely. I really, really love the book. So I'm excited to talk about it today. But before we get into all that, David, we begin each show with the same question. And that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
That's a great question. So I and you'll see this in my books, I was a writer in college as a journalist. So in one way, the answer is I was a very active journalist, and that's always made me think about writing. But my first memory as a fiction writer, and I just turned 51, so I'm a little older, was about a decade ago. While I had done other types of writing, I had never written fiction or storytelling, but I was very frustrated with one aspect of politics that's known better now than it was, called gerrymandering. It's the drawing of districts so that the results are essentially predetermined. And I remember thinking, out of a frustration that no one knew anything about it, I want to try and figure out how to write a story that makes it much more real to people how problematic it is. Now, it's a creative writing story, it's fiction, but I want a story that draws out the problems in a way that clearly the news and the nonfiction side of the world isn't doing. And that was probably almost around 10 years ago to right around now. And as I joke, that actually turned out to be a very poor idea for a novel because that's not a very exciting story. And I learned quite quickly, okay, if you're going to do that, go for it, but you better have a good story to tell. And that's when I started throwing in all sorts of characters, and I worked in Russia, so I used a Russian oligarch. And the first book actually did quite well. People like it. So I figured out how to write a good story. But that first moment was, I got to tell this story because no one seems to know the problem. And if I only write it as nonfiction, only the people who already know it's a problem will ever figure it out. I need to get to a broader audience. And that's why I wrote my first book.
Isn't that the power of fiction, though, to be able to communicate a concept that may be very difficult for a lot of people to wrap their brain around? But when you couch it in story and you attach it to a character that readers connect with and ultimately fall in love with, then that initial kernel of truth that you wanted to get out to them becomes bigger and bigger, doesn't it?
Yeah, and that's when, I knew I was doing okay. Neither of my brothers is that political, and my goal was to get beyond insiders. And both my brothers read the book, and the book's a thriller like all the ones I've written. And they said at the end, not being that political, hey, David, that was a really good book. That was exciting. And then they would say, and that gerrymandering sure sounds bad. Is that really how it works? And that's when I knew, although it's not, one of the risks of writing a book like that is you don't want to be preachy.
Right.
The story drives it all. The characters drive it all. So you don't want to overdo anything else. But the fact that they said that made me think, okay, it sort of worked. People learned something about politics and some deeper themes, but they did it within a story that didn't feel like it was hitting them over the head with it. And that's that. So it's a balance. You don't want to get carried away. But yeah, that's really what made me start. And people will find in A Simple Choice in all my books that there's sort of this. It's about the real political world we live in, but it's a story within it that hopefully is a page turner with interesting characters and a compelling narrative. And that's sort of the commonality of all my books.
You really hit on something just a second ago, David, when you said that that you didn't want to come across as preachy, and overtly political. You didn't say that per se, but that's kind of how I was taking what you were saying. As someone who has worked in politics for quite a while, that's really what separates a good politician from a great politician, is that person who can connect with their constituents and make them feel something. You can get up at an lectern and talk about policy, until you're blue in the face and until everyone in the audience is asleep. But if you could connect with them as a storyteller, then you can make them care about the things that you're trying to rally people behind, and that really is the difference in what makes a politician memorable or not, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, in one, some politicians think if they stand up there and argue data and facts, that's how they're winning. And like readers, that's not how people are thinking. And
Yeah.
if you get to them through stories and emotion and sort of gut level, reactions, but stories is the key to that. Yeah, you're far more effective than if you're trying to win an argument just throwing a bunch of data at people. And so I actually have found that and I've learned a lot about politics through writing. Think about it this way. I think and you would know this better than I, but as one writer friend of mine told me when I first started writing, and he thought my book was too plot heavy and not enough about characters, he said, David, if a reader loves your characters, they'll go with them through just about any plot. If they don't have much of a feel for your characters, it doesn't matter about the plot. Like, you'll lose them. And he said that, and I believe that for writing, but that's true of a campaign, kind of what you're saying.
Yeah.
I have seen candidates run for offices that nobody cares about before that candidate. But once they like that candidate because they like the character and they like the backstory and they know who they are, they're given support. They're making phone calls because they want that person to succeed, and that person has convinced them that they could do great things in that office. So it's a really parallel thing. Just like a good story relies on a great character, a good campaign starts with the same thing. Someone who's compelling, who's told their story well, and that story resonates with the people they're trying to get to vote for them. So there's a lot of overlap that I've learned over time.
Sure. In that first book, when you had a plot determined, you knew where you wanted the story to go, and you knew how you wanted people to feel about this topic that you were obviously passionate about. When you then realized that you needed to make it more character heavy, you needed to make the characters more likable and people that readers wanted to go on this adventure with. Where did you start in forming those characters that people were going to love?
When I first started, it was honestly, and this was I'd never written fiction, and I was myself. I told you I was thinking about gerrymandering, so I was so obsessed with that I kind of just didn't focus enough on the characters. So it wasn't they weren't fully formed, and you weren't seeing the story through their eyes. And one of the most dramatic adjustments I made to an entire book was I rewrote it in first person, because that was a way to get me inside their head, describing everything as they experienced it, as opposed to sort of from 30,000 feet. You don't have to do that. A simple choice isn't first person, but for those books, my first three, I really did do that, and it helped me think about character differently. And in the fourth book, I'm very happy about how I wrote a character through the third person, sort of close view. But that going into first person and it's a lot of work to rewrite an entire book in first person, but that was sort of my way of forcing myself to say, okay, you need to really understand and think through and have the reader understand every aspect of this character and how he sees things. And that was how I did it on the first book. And I learned lessons ever since about how to do that well. But my first round, again, as a new writer, I was consumed with a plot I thought had some good twists. And I kind of would say, didn't really go all in on the character. And that's what that very good input was telling me I had to think about.
In that first trilogy, you focused on the character of Jack Sharp, who was a journalist, and in your new book, you also have a journalist who's who we meet. Does this kind of harken back to your early career as a journalist? Is that why you connected so deeply with that type of character?
Yeah, I mean it is. I because of those early years, I wouldn't claim to be a journalist now, and a professional journalist would not want me to. But I think I created a mind. I think by being a journalist all through college, summer jobs, editor of my college paper, I think I really thought about the world in that lens, and I still think I do, and I understand how that profession works. A lot of people in politics don't, and they make a big mistake because of that. Um, and so the other thing is, journalists make great narrators because they're always digging stuff up. They're always seeking the truth or holding people accountable. So for storytelling, they turn out to be a very good character if you need characters who drive a plot forward because they're always on the hunt for something. And this day and age, we also have the issue that journalism is sort of dying, and I think it's very bad for democracy that we have a state and local level journalism that's dying. So I actually like to lift them up as sort of a hero at a time where a lot of people are worried about the state of our democracy.
Well, and if you're strictly talking about developing a protagonist, you could have a mystery or a thriller, and you could have a protagonist that was an investigator, a detective of sorts. But having a journalist affords you all sorts of opportunities to be close to the action, to dig for things like you said, while also not having to follow some of the rules and regulations of the law. It really, that type of character, that there's a reason why we have lots of mysteries and thrillers with reporters, that they really do have a unique vantage point.
Yeah, and when I had a trilogy, and again in my current book, one of my two main characters are journalists, and the other
Right.
has another really important reason to pursue something. But yeah, my books are always about trying to capture a realistic vision of the world. And it's not like most people just sit around and all of a sudden have this really intense reason to get to the bottom of something. Well, journalists do. So that's why they've, I think, been very good. And if you're going to have a trilogy where the same person keeps digging, there are, or like you said, there's police detectives, there's FBI agents, there's spies, and there's journalists. And in this case, the journalist has, Jack Sharp. And what I like about Jack Sharp, for those who haven't read these books, is he's kind of this down and out journalist in Youngstown who's kind of just checking it in, but then all of a sudden he gets really fired about a story and it revives his career. And he goes through this roller coaster ride as a journalist, but he's kind of got this really interesting arc of a guy he's just kind of, cashing it in. Not that he's making that much money, but he's lost the fire, and he refines it in the political scandals he comes across.
Those first three books that you wrote with Jack Sharp, The People's House, The Wingman, and The Voter File. With The Voter File, did you feel like that the chapter had sort of closed on Jack Sharp?
I mean, not totally, but and I could write other books with him. I mean, for the reasons we talked about, he's actually an amazing character to explore a scandal. But as I wrote this book, and this was some really good advice from my editor, and you would know this from what you do, in this book, the truth is it's the same political world as the world Jack Sharp was in. It's the same president even. But Jack Sharp was, in this story, not the closest to the action emotionally. And he just was not the ideal main character of this book. The woman in this book who grew up in Mansfield, her name is Amity Jones. She's a former Supreme Court clerk, a lawyer, a former JAG lawyer, a former member of the Army. She is actually just the better main character to tell the story because she is feeling the emotions of the story every day. And once I had the story, it was very clear to me that Jack Sharp just, as much as I'm fond of him in the other stories, he wasn't the ideal main character because he wasn't closest to not just the action, but the emotion of that action. So I put him on, I put him on recess for a little bit. Will he come back in another book? Maybe. But this wasn't the book for him to be the one telling the story.
I love to ask people about the moment of creation, that first spark of inspiration, where a book comes from. And you said in your first book you were really passionate about the topic of gerrymandering, and the story sort of grew out of that. In subsequent books, does the same sort of creative process happen? Do you start thinking of a topic and then look for characters to cast, a plot that might revolve around that? Or, is there like a news article that you read or some briefing that you get a hold of, and then the what if game starts playing? What is that first moment
It's
of
so
creation?
funny to ask that. So my second book, because for me it is moments. Something happens and I think that's a book. It's just to go very specific on you. The second book, called The Wingman, which I'm very proud of, the book occurred to me. If you may remember those crazy primary debates on the Republican side when Trump won the presidency.
Oh yeah.
Okay, they were crazy. He was at the center of it all. But there was one debate where Chris Christie, who had been kind of underperforming all these debates, decided he was going to be really nasty to Marco Rubio.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember that. I was watching
I do.
and he was so effectively nasty that he destroyed Rubio in one debate, but not in a way that helped Chris Christie, in a way that helped Donald Trump. And the minute I saw that, I thought, I've got my next plot, because my plot is all about someone else in a primary who is put there purposely to hurt the front runner. That is the title, The Wingman. The person is literally a wingman to the person everyone wants to win. And literally the book starts at a presidential debate in a primary in New Hampshire. So that was literally one debate. I'm sitting around my basement editing my other book. I was like, oh my gosh, I just got my book. The new book, Simple Choice, same story. It's about cancer research. It's about a choice every character makes about if they're given a choice to save a loved one through cutting edge research, a loved one who is going to die from cancer, but they're given the choice. I have a cure. I can save your loved one, but you must do the following things. The book is all about what choice would you make? What trade are you willing to make? What lines will you cross? All that occurred to me. I was just emailing with the person. I was sitting on a couch of a friend of mine, a couple who had just done a political thing for me, an event, and they were telling me about their kids who were involved in this new technology called CRISPR, which is a cutting-edge cancer research technology, which is both really, really, a potential huge breakthrough, but also has ethical implications. And they were done describing this technology. I thought to myself, I've got a book. So it's normally like that. There's a moment that sticks out. I think that has the makings of a great book. So it's more about a concept, and then I roll it out with characters in the story. But there's always sort of a hook or a concept that gets me going, and you just never know when it's going to hit you. And once you've written 200 pages, you just hope, my God, I hope the concept's good, because I've now dedicated a year of my life to something that I thought about on a moment's notice.
In your previous books, the Sharp books, you wrote those first person, and we're very close, obviously, because of first person, to what he's thinking and how he's going through this mystery of sorts. With A Simple Choice, we're in third person, and the camera kind of pulls back, for lack of a better term, and we have two main protagonists. Like you said, we've got Palmer Knight and we've got Amity Jones, and we kind of go back and forth. Was this how did you feel as an author in taking this approach to character viewpoint, and what did it afford you, in the writing, that maybe new tools in your toolkit that writing the other way didn't give you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that with Amity, she's not first person, but my hope is the reader, it almost feels like first person.
Right.
She's the main driver of the story, and I've got, I'm sure you thought about this, but I've got the camera on her shoulder. So it may not be right in her head in the first person, but it is real close. So my hope is someone would say, I know Amity as well as I ever knew Jack Sharp. Yeah. The other characters you get to know some, but it takes you a while to get to know them. But I have a lot of third person characters The risk of having a lot of third-person characters that you tell the story through is you can get too many. And my hope is I got it just right, where you get to know them and they're interesting enough that you want to know them. And I do that. But this book, I would say, more than my other books, because hopefully it's because I've learned how to do it better. This book has more interesting characters beyond one or two of them. And so I felt the need on a couple of the senators who are a big part of the plot. I wanted you to see how they were viewing things. So I do go to some other third-person characters. So Amity is the central character. She's the Jack Sharp from prior books. But then I do spend more time on some other characters. I think, and my general feedback is that people are keeping up with each one because they're distinctive. I think they are authentic. But I did try and get you more. And my hope is by going between the different characters, at least for me as a reader, I think the action is always moving forward, because you're not just getting one character's, weeks at a time with them. You're going back and forth and seeing a quite a complex plot through many eyes. And as long as I've done a good job of keeping track of who's saying what, I think it actually makes the story move more swiftly. Someone told me the other day on a call like this, they finished the book in 2.5 hours. Now, as a writer, that's a huge compliment, because it meant they couldn't stop. And when you write a book like this, you want a literal page turner. You do not want people all of a sudden getting bored or getting lost or getting confused. I had a woman last night at a book event say, I've already finished. And I thought, well, that's great, because it just came out. And so my hope is with multiple viewpoints in crisp chapters, you keep people moving through a plot that if you wrote a different way might get a little too heavy for folks and they may stop.
The book sort of opens with an inciting incident, and we've got a senator who apparently commits suicide in Maine. Yeah. And how did you come up with that concept? The way to, as soon as I get into the book, I'm hooked. I've got to know what's going on here. And with an incident that is seemingly not connected to the story that you're trying to tell, like, how do you come up with that way to hook readers in and to draw them into the story and keep them turning pages?
Well, what I like is it's not just someone committing suicide, which is obviously a dark way to start a story.
Yeah.
But before he does, you get to know him enough that he's, to me, and this is somewhat of the part of the point of the book, in a world right now that we actually live in where there are very few admirable political figures. When you read, I hope, about this person, you're thinking, man, I wish we had people like that in politics right now. He's a statesman. He's led a life where he just, my hope is, exudes character. And he's lived a full life. He's still in his 80s. And so I hope that the catch is, when he jumps off this cliff, and we've given away a little bit of the book, but I'm okay with that, you're really sad. You're like, wait a second, that's not who we want to go. This is someone that we're craving to have in politics, sort of the last person you'd think would do this. So what the heck happened that we're losing someone that we would admire and we want to have leading our country? So my hope is there's this contrast between this very admirable public servant and the fact that something caused him to think he had to end his life. And that begins the story in a way that hopefully, you're literally spending the book as a reader trying to figure out, why did he do that? And then you're trying to figure out, because chapter 2 starts in Mansfield, Ohio, how does all this connect up? And in the end, all of it does, because it's a much broader plot than you might first think.
Is there something unique about American politics that lends itself to the kind of story with all of the cloak and daggers, if you will, yet still allows us to maintain our hope and our view that we have the best that we could hope for in this country? Is there something unique about our political system that allows us to do that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I think we in the end, now we're in a dark time right now. So I hope the answer is yes. I spent a lot of my non-fiction side on nonfiction about threats to, and this is why I write the fiction too, threats to democracy, corruption. But I also spent a lot of time on what we can do about it. And we have gone through very dark times as a country in the past. But in the end, we've always seen our way through. Now, you take nothing for granted in a democracy. Democracy is a very rare thing in the history of this country, the history of this world, and it can devolve quickly. But our country's history has been, even at very dark moments, certain people saw a light and they kept aiming towards it, and they end up prevailing. So yeah, I think there's sort of the reality that there are moments where democracy is really under assault. But there's also this unique history of our country that, unlike in other places, we went back to first principles about democracy and we revived it. And I think that, again, that's sort of all my books have that kind of theme in it about, fighting for a country that's energized by democracy, fighting through efforts to subvert it. And that's what Amity Jones is doing in the end. That's what these are people who are trying to get us to our best place. And that really is the history of our country, is that same fight.
Yeah. David, you mentioned earlier about the intricacies of your plots and how you keep us guessing from page to page of what's going to happen next. As a writer, when you're dealing with a 400-page manuscript, how do you track your twists, your turns, your red herrings, your reveals? Have you developed a system that allows you to kind of keep track of what you're doing, so that you can trust yourself in the telling of the story?
It's a great question. So I've never been someone who has some massive outline. I sort of start and I just start writing. But then once it starts to get complicated, yeah, I mean, I will take notes and say, so and so storyline, you gotta round that out. You gotta fix it. And so for me, maybe more than other writers, because I don't outline, the editing process is the key to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Get it all down. And I'll add twists in the end that I didn't plan when I started the book. And so it's really important for me that if I'm adding, you want every twist to be, not so out of the blue that the reader rejects it. And so once I've added the final elements to the plots and any twists, any surprises, I will go back through the entire book and edit to make sure that I've given enough backstory or enough hints or enough of this and that it all sort of is smoothed out enough so it's all credible and nothing feels like kind of a cheap twist based on nothing. So for me, it really is about the editing process. And I don't mind leaving a few loose ends where the reader almost in their own mind is deciding what really happened. I don't want to answer every question. But you leave too many open and the reader will feel very unsatisfied by the end of the book. And so, yeah, when I edit, I make sure that the story of most characters, it lands in a place that the reader understands, that there isn't some massive gap between point A and point Z in terms of how it happened. And that, for me, that's all about really good editing and really good analysis of your chapters and the storylines of each character.
I have a friend who's a hardcore outliner plotter, and he says that everyone is an outliner. It's just a matter of whether you outline before you start writing or when you edit. And I've always thought that was kind of funny.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
Here's my problem, and it may be just me, but I've actually read other authors say something. My creative juices are not flowing unless I'm writing, actual writing.
Right.
And if I sit there at an outline, it's just not firing away. And maybe I'm getting older, so this is why. My creative juices do not get fired up by outlines.
Yeah.
I need to be writing. And as I write, I challenge myself. I think about what's next. What would logically come next? What would that character think or do? And an outline does not do that for me. And so what I will do is, I guess I could say I outline as I go. Like if I'm at one chapter, I will jot down a few notes. It's not an outline. Okay, what would happen next? What should the next 3 or 4 chapters look like? And then I keep going. And then later on, I think, okay, how is this going to wrap up? So I guess I'm like, as that person said, I'm more of an outline as I go, or at the end as I edit. But it's always part of writing, because if I'm not writing, I'm not thinking through. Like it's a very, I mean, you're almost in the, going back to Amity Jones or Jack Sharp, I almost am in that character's head thinking, what should I do realistically next to get out of the jam I'm in? What would I actually do? And I also do that, by the way, when I think about what the bad guy would do. And if I'm not in that, and by the way, that character is not outlining. That's the problem. Once I'm in that mindset writing, that's when I'm really thinking it through. And I've been in places, by the way, and this is true of a lot of writers, I'm sure. I didn't have writer's block, but I reached a moment where my character was so trapped that I was thinking, well, my God, how do I get out of this trap? I don't know. And for days, I couldn't write a sentence because I'm stewing. How would this character get out of the trap I wall them into? And I had 2 choices. I need to wall them in less, or I need to really get creative about how I get out of it. And ultimately, about 4 days into this one moment I'm remembering, I had a dream about it. And I woke up, I thought, well, there we go. I got my way out. But I'm writing more in that way than I am sort of some hard outline from the beginning. It's just not the way that apparently my brain works.
Well, whatever you have found that works for you, please keep doing it, David. A simple choice available everywhere now. We're going to put links to it where you can grab it in Kindle edition or hardback if you prefer to hold the book in your hand, or audiobook. Have you heard any of the audiobook yet, David?
I listened to a few of the reads, and by the way, once you have a major publisher, one of the best things about it is it's fun to choose your reader.
Yeah.
And they sent me several different ones. And for me, one woman really stuck out is exactly what I thought of when I thought of Amity Jones. And they wrote an email back saying, okay, well, we'll try and get her to say yes. And she did. So I have not heard the whole thing yet, but when I heard her read some of it, she fit it perfectly, and I was so glad that that's who they chose. My past book, what's been funny and fun is, and I don't have as much of this in this book, although I do have, some characters. I have a Scottish professor, but I had a Russian, a Ukrainian, a guy from Kazakhstan. So those books were really difficult to read for because you needed someone who, and I worked in Russia, so I know what a Russian accent sounds like in English. Finding someone who could pull off all those accents was actually really hard. And if someone gets stuff like that wrong, it can really be distracting. So those were challenging. But in this case, the minute I heard this one reader, I thought we've got a great person, and she ended up being the reader for the book.
Love it. Also, go visit your local bookstore and pick up A Simple Choice there. David, if people are just discovering you and want to dig into all the great stuff that you do, is there a place where they can connect with you online?
Yeah, the biggest and best way by far is I'm very active on Twitter. Caution, I'm quite political on Twitter, so if you don't agree with everything, not everyone's going to. But in my Twitter account is David Pepper. You can go to my website. You can follow me on Facebook. I have a public account that people can follow. But by far, I have Instagram too, David Pepper 4 Ohio, the number 4 in YouTube. But if you really are interested in fiction writing, issues around democracy, not only in Ohio but elsewhere, at David Pepper is my most active place by far. And I think those who are into either the writing side or I do a lot of videos. I do a lot of whiteboard videos, explainers on democracy and politics. They get a lot of views. So that's probably the best place is my Twitter account at David Pepper.
Excellent. We'll link that up to make it easy for folks to find you. This has been so much fun chatting. Thank you for taking time to come on the show.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for, when you're a writer like this, you just love talking about writing, and to have someone like yourself who interviews us and we get into some of the details is a lot of fun. So thanks for having me, and thanks for doing what you're doing.